Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our keynote opening presentation for the LSX Nordic Congress 2021. Delighted to be joined by Adam Kostyal, SVP with Nasdaq, who have been our long-term hosts, supporters and partners for the Nordic Congress, who's going to be guiding through a presentation on the Nasdaq Nordic Markets and growth capital in the Nordic region. So I'll be back later on to moderate some Q&A with the audience here. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask Adam, please do post it in the chat function. You'll see just to the bottom right of your screen, there is a live discussion box. If you click the up arrow, and then within that, you can either chat, either to ask a question or amongst other attendees and listeners to the session, or indeed a questions box if you have any specific questions you'd like to ask. So I'd encourage you to please use that this morning and indeed throughout the rest of the event, so we can have as interactive of a Congress as possible. But for now, delighted to hand you over to Adam to guide you through this morning's keynote presentation. So Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here, so to speak, virtually, but pleasure to be participating with LSX. Once again, a great partner to us and a great partner for the overall ecosystem. So, and hopefully next year in meeting everyone physically rather than virtually. But it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Adam Kostyal. I head up our listings for Nordics and Europe, which essentially in Europe means Europe to US. So we on a yearly basis assist probably close to 30 companies or even SPACs now accessing the US markets, either through a primary or dual listing. So I will try to address today not only the activity that we're seeing in the Nordic markets, but also the activity that we're seeing towards the US and what our role is in that context. So looking forward to the discussion and any questions that you might have. So in terms of the presentation, this is maybe old news for everyone, so I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but Nasdaq is a Nordic player and a global player in that context. We own and operate 7 exchanges in the Nordic markets, which essentially is an equivalent to roughly 2 billion in market cap, 2,000 billion in euros in market cap, and roughly 3.5 thousand million in turnover per business per day in terms of trading activity. So probably from a equity activity perspective, probably one of the most active markets in Europe. I saw a recent statistics that the Nordics represent 23% of all IPO activity in Europe during last year, and this year so far. So again, very, very busy equity markets, very busy market overall in the Nordics, and in particular in Stockholm, which has continued to be the most active market in Europe in terms of number of listings. So what do we have within and what is our strategy within the Nordics? Well, we have our growth market, which is Nasdaq First North. I'll come back to that, trying to give you some more insight on what is happening on Nasdaq First North. And within Nasdaq First North, you also have the Premier segment, which is essentially on the same platform as Nasdaq First North, but sets a few different requirements in terms of governance, in terms of IFRS, etc. And then we have our main market. So the whole idea here is really to offer the companies a journey. And that journey is really to be able to access the market earlier, and choosing the public markets rather than VC money or private money, and taking control of its own destiny in terms of leveraging the values the public market can provide them with at an earlier stage, and then really grow into the platform through the Premier segment, and then the graduation to the main market. We've had roughly 110 companies now that have taken this journey from First North to the main market. And we see this as a fantastic stepping stone, not only for us as a market, but also for investors to be able to start investing earlier in growth companies and then being able to support them into the main market step by step. And we have this opportunity across our Stockholm market, the Copenhagen market, the Helsinki market, and Icelandic market. So we're seeing this activity level in terms of leveraging the stepping stone mechanism in all of the markets. And the next stepping stone that we have to offer is the US. So we are the partner of choice for European companies. So 83% of the companies that have gone to the US from Europe are going to Nasdaq. So my team and I spend a lot of time trying to help companies access the US markets. So far in the US, there's been close to 500 IPOs overall. 80% of these IPOs are choosing Nasdaq. And what we want to do here basically is to make sure that European or Nordic companies feel comfortable talking and engaging with us to make sure they maximize the value of this transition. At the end of the day, we don't determine when the time is right. That is market driven and company specific. But from our perspective, if the company wants to take this next part of the journey to go to the US markets, we're there to help. And we definitely want to make sure they can maximize the value of having Nasdaq on both sides, especially for our Nordic companies. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us to engage in that dialogue. At the end of the day, the Securities Commission is a key cornerstone, which is outside our control, but there are a number of parameters which we define and we judge, and therefore can be of good assistance in helping the companies doing so efficiently. Now, the key driver, I think this is old news, but just for repetition's sake, it's just a vast difference of the depth of the market that you have in the US. Now, the Nasdaq Nordics definitely punches above its weight compared to many of the European markets, but still the gap towards US is large. And I think at the end of the day, it's not obvious to go to the US and expect a higher valuation. But what you do get if you go to the US and do it right, is that you get access to a platform with a deeper market and a broader reach in terms of specialty investors and deeper pockets. The challenge is with such an active market as we're seeing today, is how do you do this cost efficiently? How do you do this efficiently in terms of accessing the market in the right way? And making sure that the investors are seeing you and that you are creating that visibility for yourself after having taken on that journey in transitioning to the US. And again, when I say transitioning to the US, a large part of the companies going to the US are dual listings. So here is a slide showing you a whole range of companies that have taken the journey from the US from the European markets to the US, either through a primary listing or a dual listing. And we see that there's a good acceptance in the US markets to actually start the journey here and then transitioning into the US through a dual listing. And we definitely do recommend most companies to combine that with a capital raise. And it's not only small companies doing this. You see most recently, if you look in terms of looking back the last 2 years, the GemMab dual listing was quite a significant outlier, but it also goes to show that even large companies can benefit from accessing the US markets through a listing. And again, it's not only about the capital markets, it's about also the commercial dimension of positioning the company in a broader daylight towards the US market. And that in itself, beyond increasing the reach towards investors, also gives you more visibility towards the US market, potentially increases visibility towards other investors, potentially makes you a target for investment or acquisition, but also gives you the US share for further acquisitions from your end. So there are so many dimensions there that add value from a commercial perspective. But at the end of the day, it's about return on investment and really making sure that you understand the risks, the pros and cons of evaluating the market reach to the US. And again, we're there to help, happy to assist, and my team is more than willing to engage earlier to have these discussions with you. the other aspect is, whether to do first a first step in the local market and then go to the US. This is $1 million question. But what we have seen is we've seen a number of good examples of companies that have performed well. Genmab is one. Argenx is another one. And we've really seen, how the value of the timing of doing the dual listing, both for a larger and smaller company, have been quite significant. Now, from our perspective, we're extremely proud of the market that we have here in the Nordics. And if you look at 2020, going back to 2016, we see a continued very busy market. And just to be clear, this year has been busier than ever. So we are close to 117 listings, 120 listings this year only. And a large part of these are IPOs. So it's an extraordinary year from the capital market perspective, both in private and public. But the fact that we're able to list smaller and medium-sized companies, growth companies, means that we have an activity level which is way beyond any other European market today. And that means that we potentially have the next Genmab or the next Calliditas that is taking on the journey to engage with the public markets here. And then once they feel the time is right, they might step into taking on the US market as a next step. And that's really what we're seeing, is that the European dynamic and the Nordic dynamic of having smaller companies come to market earlier and then go to the US is a natural transition. And as the platform is growing in terms of listings, we're also seeing a broader investor reach, and overall, not only investor reach, but also trading reach. So we are seeing that this marketplace, which typically was a very local flavor, is now becoming an international flavor, giving companies already on Nasdaq First North a much broader international reach in terms of investors and traders. So from that perspective, we see a great traction in terms of investor reach and overall a very strong liquidity on the Nasdaq First North growth market. So it's not only a place where you raise money, it's also a very liquid marketplace overall. Now, in terms of this sector, it is one of our most active sectors by far, in terms of secondaries, in terms of primaries. The healthcare space, which of course includes many different specialties, it continues to be significant. And we have roughly 200 companies listed. The majority of these are on First North, but we have a large representation across the Nordics in the main market, both on small cap, mid cap, and large cap. And if you look at the range in terms of small cap healthcare companies, we have roughly 27 of these, and this is the range in terms of the market cap size. And this is all data that will be made available to you, but this just goes to show how many smaller companies we have, and where we clearly have one outlier, which is Vimian. And probably Vimian is a special case, but Vimian is, of course, a consolidation of the healthcare space within for animals and pets. So probably should not be in this graph, but clearly creates this outlier. But that was the largest listing that we have had on Nasdaq First North, and that was a direct listing, roughly 4 billion in market cap. So a significant listing on Nasdaq First North. Just goes to show the strength of the market to be able to support companies in a strong way. And then from 2017 to 2021, we've had a continuous flow of new healthcare companies coming to the market, most of them in Sweden, but we're seeing good activity level in Finland and in Denmark as well. And many other Nordic companies also looking towards Stockholm. So happy to engage with you in determining which market is the best and how we support you in our Nordic markets as well. But on average, we've had, on a range, close to 20 companies the last few years per year listing with us in the Nordic markets. And the Nasdaq First North platform in itself continues to outperform. So I do recommend you have a look at it from an investment point of view. There is an ETF now or certificate trading the Nasdaq First North Growth platform, but over the years, it's really shown an extraordinary return in comparison to the First North overall index, which still outperforms, and also in comparison to AIM and the OMX index. And again, the healthcare sector on Nasdaq OMX has also outperformed. So again, this is a very exciting space, better understood than ever amongst our investor base, and therefore also that is giving a return in terms of the commitment that you're getting from investors and the understanding from the investors. And when we then look at the European biotechnology sector, there's today in Europe on approximately 250 biotech companies on the exchanges in Europe with a total market cap of roughly $203 billion. This is of course a moving target, but it just goes to show how significant the Nasdaq Nordic platform is with main market and Nasdaq First North in comparison to the other markets in Europe. Now, what does this do? It really creates an ecosystem of knowledge around advisors, investors, research, peers, etc., which makes the ecosystem a lot more thriving than what we're seeing in many other marketplaces in Europe, both for primary and secondary markets. And I think from that perspective, that makes the Nordic markets probably a stronger stepping stone than many other European markets. And that's why we're seeing probably a bit less activity from the Nordics to the US. But having said that, once you have grown in the Nordic markets, you might feel that there's a need or there's a good timing to go to the US. And that's again when the US markets could be relevant in combination with the capital raise. And again, the biotech sector remains, significant, and this is a different way of looking at it. But again, we will share this with you after. So that was my overall presentation. I think from my perspective, in summary, and you can look and slice and dice all this data in so many different ways, but essentially with the activity level that we're seeing, both on the primary and secondary market, we're seeing more and more international participation in our Nordic markets than ever, both on the primary and secondary. And I think the secondary market in particular is becoming more interesting because you're seeing growth companies being able to raise substantial amounts of money, but not only from Nordic investors, with also anchor invested by international players that are having their eyes on the growth opportunity that is arising in the Nordic markets. And that's largely driven by the fact that we are listing companies in a way that many other markets are not. So therefore, the ability to invest in a public company is always going to be much more significant than a private company. And in terms of the activity level that we see towards the US, of course, this whole Corona wave, which is still with us, has also driven the awareness around biotech and healthcare in a way which we have not seen before. And we are seeing now more traction from Europe to US, and the activity level, both on the primary and the dual listing aspect, is higher than ever. So the team is very busy and engaged with these companies to make sure we are helping them in the most possible way. I'll leave it there, maybe open up for some questions, and then we can also go back through the slides where relevant, depending on the questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adam. So if you do have any questions, please do post them in the chat function to the bottom right of your screen. I certainly have a few myself that I wanted to ask to sort of kick us off here. We also have you joining us tomorrow, Adam, on a panel titled "To List or Not to List." That is the question. So without giving away too much from some of the discussions we're going to have tomorrow, a few things I was keen to dig into. One, I think this has been quite common throughout the years, but you'd mentioned that a lot of the new listings being on the Swedish exchanges. And there was some activity in Finland and Denmark, but Sweden still was dominating. I guess for the life science and healthcare sector as a whole, do you see this changing anytime soon, or do you think it's always going to be that Sweden is the sort of the most chosen market for life science companies choosing to list? And I guess follow-up question, is there anything being done to sort of try and generate more activity and interest in some of those other markets?
Yeah, well, that's a very relevant question. I think this is in general the challenge Europe has. We are fragmented geographically. Each market is its own liquidity pool. It's not one European liquidity pool, and that's a long discussion. Why aren't we achieving that on a European level? Why aren't we achieving that on the Nordic level? The good thing from a Nordic perspective is that from a trading perspective, essentially the reach is fairly much Nordic. The investor reach, however, is not Nordic. The investor reach in many cases is still quite local. So you will see that many investors will only invest in companies that are listed in the local market. And so by listing for example, if you're a Finnish company and listing in Helsinki, you might not be able to target the same type of investors for your IPO or your secondary over time by being listed in Helsinki. Now, having said that, Helsinki and Copenhagen have grown quite significantly over the last 2 years or last 3 years, and we're seeing a higher level of activity than we have seen before. But at the end of the day, there's a strong overlap between the Nordic markets. The advisors are the same. In terms of the names, you have everything from Carnegie, SEB, Nordea, Danske Bank, the list is long. And the Nordic teams on JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Citi, and Goldman, they're also Nordic. So they know each other, the investors, they know each other. So I think the actual aspect of listing in Stockholm or dual listing in Stockholm is something that has become very acceptable and manageable. And from our perspective, we're definitely not pushing against it. At the end of the day, it's for the company to decide where they can achieve best results. So we're supporting them independent of which market they choose in the Nordics. If they feel that Stockholm will provide them better support over time, either through a primary or dual listing, we will support them and work actively with them. And that's why we've seen a number of Danish companies, a number of Finnish companies, even Norwegian companies come to Stockholm and either through a primary or dual listing, and we feel this is nothing wrong. It's just an evolution, and we support it. And we continue to try to strengthen the local markets, and we continue to try to make our markets more Nordic. But the reality is that there's a lot of layers of barriers which are outside our control to make this an important Nordic liquidity pool.
Makes sense, certainly. And I guess you also sort of shared some of the statistics on listings over the last few years, and the sort of huge amount of activity that we've seen, particularly in the last sort of 7 months or so through 2021, and a huge number of listings. Do you see this sort of trend continuing, this sort of large window of companies listing set to continue? I guess more generally for on the exchange, but also for the life science and biotech sector. You obviously mentioned that the pandemic threw healthcare and life sciences very much to the fore of people's minds, and a lot of capital poured into the space for investors. But do you see the sort of high level of listing activity continuing, or do you see any perceived potential risks, I guess, in terms of the IPO market?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. Owning my funds as well, so I'm trying to understand what's going to happen. But so I wish I had the crystal ball. I would definitely share it with you. I think the interesting thing that we have in our role as a marketplace, both in the US and in the Nordics, is we do see the aggregated volume that and rather than maybe seeing it from an investor point of view, where you just see your own volume. And the volume is insane. Both on the primary and secondary, we're seeing activity level that we have not seen any time before. Is this a good sign or bad sign? I think it's fantastic that companies are coming to market and able to raise capital for the further growth. And we should be, enjoying this moment as a unique opportunity for many companies. Will this window be open for a longer period of time? It looks like the window is certainly open until the end of the year, if you judge by the pipeline. And I think everybody is, of course, a bit concerned about the pipeline and the window. So I think a lot of are pushing to try to at least do this during 2021. But having said that, already 2022 is looking to be very active. I think the biggest concern we're seeing in the markets, of course, is are we going back to, I'm not trying to say that I'm an expert here, but, the generic concerns that we're seeing is, are we going back to, a pandemic level, which will create a prohibiting market for growth? Again, it would probably make this healthcare space a lot more interesting again, because we're learning to live with COVID in a way which we had assumed maybe in the beginning would go away. And then the second aspect is, where is inflation going and how much inflation can we live with all the subsidies that you're seeing in the market? And I think even though inflation will go up, of course, cheap money will become more expensive, but overall, we're going to live with low inflation rates for a long time. And as long as we accept each step we take and we adjust to each step we take, we will continue to see potentially a more volatile equity market, but still a very attractive equity market from an investment point of view. So, and of course, SPACs have been driven by this incredible low inflation environment, and also as a source of, getting access to the market. It's become relevant for this space as well. But I think the inflationary drive and potentially some uncertainty around the SPAC market has created a slowdown in that sector. But we will see more, we will see SPAC activity going forward, maybe not at the level that we have seen before. So in summary, continued active market from our end, but definitely more volatile as we adjust to new inflationary environments. But still, on a broader level, it's going to be a low inflationary environment. So I think equity markets will still be in favor.
Interesting. And one other thing you should have mentioned as well was the sort of increased international participation in the markets. I think you said particularly US investors, but is it, I guess, primarily driven by US investors? Is that, or there are other international?
No, I think the fact that we have such an active market and have had such an active market over the last few years in comparison to many other markets. I mean, I think Germany had 12 listings last year compared to our, 80 plus. It means that essentially you're having an opportunity, a capital raise opportunity. And over the years, the international investor base has followed this market, gotten used to it, met companies that have listed, and now are much more familiar with the local market here and are participating not only in secondaries, but also in IPOs. So we have seen a number of IPOs that have been anchored by specialist investors from the US or from Europe. And I think that's a fantastic sign that the credibility of the market is not driven by us as an operator, but through the success of our listed companies. They are themselves attracting investors, and therefore the importance of having a strong peer group is key for the outliers to be able to access investors that are now familiar to our markets.
Makes sense. I guess if anyone does have any last questions they wanted to throw in, please do post them now. Also aware that, as I said, we have Adam joining us on a session tomorrow morning looking at the specific question to list or not to list, and also on a session tomorrow afternoon looking at cross trading. So don't want to dig too much into some of the issues that we will be getting into over the next couple of days. I guess for any companies who are currently still private, though, and considering an IPO, I guess one piece of advice I think is always useful is when to start engaging, when to start planning for that process, and sort of the key steps that maybe need to be considered and in what sort of time frame. We hosted our IPO bootcamp with some of the team yesterday, and there's a lot of discussions around that. So I guess for companies who are looking to sort of tap into the public markets, do you have any sort of specific advice for them in terms of timelines or early advice if they are considering that step?
Well, I think, the fact that we have established Nasdaq First North in such a credible way, it means that companies can access the public markets with essentially the same advisors and investors to a certain extent as the main markets. But really what we've done is that we've made the public markets much more accessible earlier. Now, a lot of people question this, is this the right thing for the development that smaller companies can access smaller, more unpredictable companies can access public markets with the responsibilities so early? Well, my view is that this sector is in a particularly good space when it comes to public markets. Documentation, governance, that's key. If you don't have that in place, you shouldn't be in this sector overall. So managing the layer of being a public company is probably relatively small compared to the challenge of being a listed company for maybe other sectors. Now, the other aspect is that it's not easy to find VC capital for many of these companies, and the pros and cons of VC capital versus public market capital are debatable, and of course, case by case. So from that perspective, you're able to get funding through the public markets earlier. So I would definitely, as a company, not have the vision that one day I will go list on the main market. Rather assess when, what kind of, captivity would you be able to get amongst investors on First North? And would it make sense to take the first step there? Because we have had some fantastic examples of companies that have done that journey from First North to the main market, and then eventually to the US as well. So I think from that perspective, understand the requirements that we're setting on First North, understand the pros and cons of that, but definitely do not have the vision that only the main market is a solution and only the US is a solution. Evaluate these options carefully, and we're there to assist wherever we can in terms of contacts, advice, and whatever input we can provide that is valuable. But the solution is not to go public. It's about making sure that you're ready to go public when the time is right for you as a company, and that is individually driven.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, as Adam said, they're there to help and to give advice to companies who are looking at that. So I would encourage you to visit their sponsor zone, and you can interact with all the members of the team who are on the platform, and indeed with all of our partners for the event. I think I mentioned this morning in my opening remarks. Would also encourage you all to please make full use of the platform through the chat function, through the one-to-one partnering, checking out the company showcases, and getting involved in the interactive sessions throughout. We'll be back at 10 o'clock CET for our keynote panel featuring a number of life science leaders who have passed some significant milestones over the last 18 months or so. So we're digging into some of those success stories, and I guess some of the opportunities and challenges that they faced over the last 18 months. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Adam for his presentation this morning and for kicking us off for the Nordic Congress. As I said, there'll be more from him over the next couple of days. But for now, maybe time to grab a coffee, explore the platform, and we'll see you again at 10 o'clock.
Thank you very much. Thanks.